Good morning, afternoon, evening, all. Thanks for joining us again for another maturity model for Microsoft 365 Practitioners Group, February 2022. So we're talking about governance, risk and compliance. I don't remember if we went back, I think, to our first ever session, and we asked the question when we had Liam on talking about security. Is this something which we should do? And Nikki and Simon in particular have picked this up and worked on it. So congratulations, thank you to them. So if I flick through our agenda today, as ever, we'll give you a bit of an update of what's been going on in the maturity model, any new artifacts and updates. We'll have our shout out and picture times. We'll do a together mode so that we all can remember that we were all here, and we will go into the governance, risk and compliance competency. As ever, we would love to hear about what your thoughts are on the competency. So please share those with us. Can I move to the next slide?
I think, Simon, you might even be able to run the slides yourself, so try that.
It's telling me I have to sync to I will try and move that forward. Does that move people forward? No, it says sync to presenter. If I could be moved on to the approach and articles on Microsoft Docs, that'd be great. Nikki's just joined, brilliant. So we are talking about the purpose of this, of course, is about the maturity model is all about helping organizations get more out of Microsoft 365, but understanding, from a business perspective, what the benefits are for things which a business wants to do. So we've divvied up the model into competencies around areas where the business we think should be good at collaboration, communication, and it's up to the business to decide where it wants to focus its attention on. But we give some guidance of what the benefits would be if you took from a immature place to a mature place, what the benefits would be in each of those competencies. I thank you, Hugo. I will do that. Right. So here we go. So we've got 5 levels, starting at level 100, whereas our initial kind of initial state, that default state, where we move up through the levels to 200, where we are doing something towards moving into into managed state. We're starting to define some processes, ways of working, but it's not consistent across the organization, through into level 300, where we are being consistent around how we do something in the organization, up to level 400, where we're starting to measure what is going on with those processes, so that we can see how things are working, and then using those metrics, moving into level 500, where we can start optimizing and improving based on those metrics. So if I move through to the intent. So here we've just taking that model and turning it into a sort of a single sentence, really. What is it that we're intending to do in that level? So level 100, we just want to make sure that the thing, that we're able to function. We don't care how we function, as long as we function, through to up to level 500, where there's this the nirvana, where whatever anything throws at us, we can be resilient, we can change, we can be in a better, smarter place. So if we move on to how you can get involved, that's what it's all about. It's all about the community, about involving others. We have some ideas. We'll kind of suggest those, but I bet people have got better ideas than we have, and we'd love to hear them. Hence why this session is right now, that Nikki and Simon had some great ideas, and they've put pen to paper, and that's fantastic. So looking for people to come and have a chat on this session, maybe present a case study on how they've leveraged 365, how they've used the maturity model to help that as well. You can contribute on GitHub, raising issues, providing feedback, saying what you do and don't like, or even just you think something's good and you want to socialize it around the LinkedIn, Twitter, TikTok, whatever floats your boat. So we'd like to you to get involved. Okay, I'll hand over to who would like to pick up to talk about what we've got coming up in the future.
I'll mute myself, that'll help. Right, I've got a bit of a sore throat, everyone, so if I go quiet, because I'm probably coughing and turn my microphone off. So today we're going to talk about governance, risk and compliance. I'm just going to touch on that. When we mooted this originally, it was going to be governance. And the more we talked about it, the more we realised it was a broader topic than that. And Nikki will talk a bit more about why it's governance, risk and compliance, but we've bundled those together. We've explicitly taken the decision not to include security in that, and we'll talk about that later as well. Then next month, we've got a brand new shiny guest star in the form of Tracy van der Schiff, who's going to just go back and help us revisit one of the earlier competencies we did, which was around people and communities. So we're going to go back and look at that with Tracy at that time. So that's thank you for that. I think it's a really big deal as well. So, so that's great. And again, one of the things that's really struck me over the last few months is this is a truly global audience. We're getting people from many different continents appearing, not just the US and the UK. So well done to all of us for that. So that's next month. Just the usual thing. Thank you everybody who came along to January. That was terrific. And as you can see, we've got a consistently high number of attendees at these sessions. We hope you're finding them of use. Don't forget, you can reach out to us, as some people have done, if you're stuck to know what to do with the information that we've offered or how to get involved in some of the tools or whatever. We're here to help. The next session is on the 15th of March. This being a 28-day month, it's the same day of the month. And don't forget that we've got other activities around the PMP and sharing is caring community as well. Right, it's that time when we try and grab a video of everybody who's attending. So David, would you do your magic, please? And everybody who's up for it, please turn your video camera on, and we'll grab a wavy, happy picture of all the attendees who are not too shy and addressed appropriately.
Absolutely. Yep. And I just took over screen sharing just so everybody can see everybody. And we will give it just 1 minute. Still got some seats open. Tickets are for sale for free. All right. Let's kick off the recording, and we're live. So say hello. Woo! All right. Get those hands up and waving. I see Marc is in a twister. What a world. What a world. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Right. So with that, I just need to get us back into the presentation. To see if that's going to work for you. I've not actually used the PowerPoint live stuff before, but that seems to be working pretty well. So let's just get to slide 10. Right, so it's my pleasure to introduce Nikki. Nikki, are you ready for this? You can just wave for now, okay?
Yep, ready.
Yeah, there we go. So I'd like to introduce Nikki. So Nikki and I have worked together quite a lot over the last 2 months, really, trying to get this and some other governance stuff together. Nikki's just taken on a new role as Principal Cloud Architect at Cloudway, and you can read the rest of the slide yourself. For me, it's been a pleasure working with Nikki. It's really interesting. Governance is something which is close to my heart because I run a medtech company and I'm really exposed to governance, compliance and risk issues, and I get to go to jail if we screw up. So it's been very interesting getting a proper professional view on what I should have been doing and helping to put some of my own thoughts into that. So with no more words from me, apart from just reminding everybody that you can do what you're all getting quite good at, which is interact live. You know, give us those hands and hearts and the other smiling faces, etc. But equally, ask questions, stick your hand up if you want to ask a question live. Also, ask a question via chat, and we'll pick it up and try and use it. So don't be shy. If you've got thoughts, observations, concerns, any of the above, jump right in. Nikki and the rest of us will handle that. So, Nikki, why don't you tell us a bit about governance and compliance?
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for having me here today. So, as Simon said, we've probably been working on this about 3 months now, just before Christmas. So we kind of thought really needed to add a competency to the maturity model. So sort of governance and compliance and risk is really close to my heart, and in everything I do within in Microsoft 365, it's really important to understand how to put it in. And I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned working with Microsoft 365 is such a complex, intertwined infrastructure. People don't really know how to do compliance, and that's the thing is, you know, it's big, it's scary, it's out there, you can get fined, you can go to jail, but how do we really do this? So that's why I wanted to try and put something in place. A lot of organizations haven't got the funds to have big teams of IT people, but compliance impacts everyone, no matter the size of your business. So we really needed to put something together to really support businesses, whether they're small, medium or large, and depending on what sort of risk. And this is what it comes down to when we were talking about governance. You can govern things, but are you governing it in the right way? Are you making sure that you are complying with particular rules and regulations? And really to make sure that you don't make it too hard for the end users. I've worked with organisations and they're saying GDPR, no one can access any of this details, we'll lock it all down. You make it too hard then, and what happens is people will go elsewhere. They'll go off and use shadow technology, or they'll go off and use consumer-based technology. The number of organisations that I've dealt with that are using, say, WhatsApp, you know, and, you know, I worked with a UK defence organisation, and they made it so hard to do anything, and even to kind of go forward with any changes. Yet everybody was using the shadow IT, which means you've lost control. So how can you govern it? How can you manage your risks? You can't. So what we need to do is find that happy medium where people can be productive and effective within the environment that we've got, yet ensuring that we maintain compliance. So that's why we've kind of got these 3 areas, really. We need to define that governance, those strategies, those rules, those frameworks, where we want to get to, how are we going to do it, how are we going to direct and govern this, who's responsible. Then it's that real risk-based rules that we need to think in there. You know, if it's too difficult, as I mentioned, people will go elsewhere. If it's too lax, then you could be severe penalties from fines, going to jails, or kind of end of your business if regulations are put in place. So we need to have that balancing of that risk. And it's not just an IT responsibility. It's really important that governance, risk and compliance impacts the whole of that organisation. And then it's also important to kind of weave in those compliance. What are those external regulations and controls that you must follow? So whether it's GDPR or various other things. Those things where, you know, you must conform to those rules or be penalised. But it's really important to note that compliance is not the same as security. So you can tick all the boxes and put all of the controls in place for being compliant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're secure. So what we've tried to do here is look at the governance, risk and compliance, but it's really important that this is interwoven with the security aspects as well, because this you know, is not looking necessarily external threat protection and other things like that. So the two have to go hand in hand. But I think it's like a lot of other things within this whole maturity model. You can't tackle everything together. So we've got to kind of put it together in chunks. So we've decided that governance, risk and compliance goes together well. So move on. So why do we really need this kind of governance, risk and compliance maturity model? I think there's 3 key reasons for this. Number one, data is exploding. There is data everywhere now, whether it's within Microsoft 365. If we just look at that, there are so many different applications in there. What data is being stored where? We know that people have this propensity to go out and use shadow IT, to use consumer technology. It's all too easy nowadays just to get hold of this, particularly the cloud SaaS applications. So we need to make sure we put some controls and rules and best practice. So a lot of this is down to the people side of things. People need to understand what they need to use and why they need to use it. It's not just about those technology. Secondly, the data regulations are increasing. So there's a huge amount of them. If anybody's looked within the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, there's a set of standard assessment and optional assessments that you can buy add-on assessments. I think there's over 150 there now. So by default, you get a baseline assessment, and depending on your licenses, you may get a few more. But there's about 150 of them. Some of them have got complementary controls. Some of them will have controls that are a conflict with each other. So how do you manage that? So it's having something that can pull that in together. So say the compliance assessments in Microsoft 365 help us in a way where they're pulling that kind of an overlay together and say, what's that big picture look like, rather than one by one. And then thirdly, it's about the risks of not being compliant. Can a company really afford not to be compliant? And I think this is where we struggle with some organisations. They don't know what that risk of compliance is. So what we really need to do, we need to make sure that protecting data has become much more challenging. So how can we tackle that? We need to try and look at something that we can make it more simple and make it easier for people to reduce those risks. Put it into sort of bite-sized chunks, not have a big overwhelming project that says everything must be done in the next 2 or 3 months. It's an iterative approach. And what I feel like is that governance, risk, compliance is not a project. For me, it's a lifestyle. It has to really be bedded in with our business as usual processes. So let's have just a look, just to hear some example regulations. So we're looking really more at the database regulations, because sort of compliance covers a whole vast range of different stuff. But for the focus of this, because it's all around Microsoft 365, we're focusing at the database ones. So you've got country or regional based compliance. So things like GDPR impact all organisations that are working with personal data. In the UK, you can get fined up to 4% of your annual turnover, or up to 20 million. You've got compliance, things like PCI DSS. This is a global standard whereby if you're processing, storing or transmitting credit card data, you need to comply with. So that's to do with kind of a functional based compliance. You've got things like HIPAA, which is a US healthcare regulation. So that is a country and a business area. Or you've got other ones like the California data protection, the CCPA, that has recently come in. So with those, you can see there's different types of fines for different types of activities. But as well as being fined, you've got things like reputational risk. A lot of these cases now get publicised, and you can do damage to your business. And in some case, if they withdraw functionality, that may stop your business and, really hit your bottom financial line. Also, in addition to this, we thought we'd put in things like your standards. So things like ISO 27001. These are kind of optional, opt-in based best practice. So really, as you go up the higher levels, really, of the maturity model, you're looking to make sure that you're up with the best, so you can have things like these additional standards that cover information security and also compliance. So this is where the two of them really kind of lock together and become one. So let's look at some examples here. So these are some examples within the last few months. So JP Morgan were fined 125 million by the US Securities and Exchange Commission. So it's a bank. You would think a bank would be compliant, that everyone would have to know what they're doing. But here they've admitted that employees were communicating about business matters on personal devices, text messages, and hey, guess what? WhatsApp. So this is, endemic in a lot of organizations, that sometimes things have become too hard, so people will find the easy option out. So that was 125 million. And this was company wide, so it wasn't sort of hid in a corner in one particular area. Then we've got one based in the UK. So this was one where over 1,000 people in our New Year's honours list, their data was inadvertently published online with all their names and addresses. So for 1,000 names and addresses, that was a £500,000 fine. And the last one, this is a French one, a company called Slympay. So they had published their end user details, their banking details. This is quite common. This one is people want to know how to test out their new IT services. And in their test environment, you've got some dummy data, but what's the best way of testing it? Let's test it with real data. And that's what they did. They took a copy of their production system, put it in their test system. So that's great for making sure you've got all your tests. But then they didn't realise that it was there after the project was closed. They didn't clean it off. That then server was available publicly without any protection at all. So these are some of the bigger companies. But compliance applies to anybody really, and you don't just get fined. Sometimes if you look at things, I was looking at the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK website, and there's kind of often warnings. If you've done your very best to be compliant, you've put your rules in place, you can demonstrate that you're monitoring it and you're doing your very best, and there's still an issue, then normally you don't tend to get fined if you've put effort in. But these ones have shown that people have been not treating compliance seriously. They have got gaps. They haven't really gone through and understood their current environment and put the best practices in place and then monitored it. So let's have a look. So really going forward, what we need to do is look to see, are we compliant? How do we kind of get to that measure of measuring that and prioritising our risks? If you speak to people in an organisation, the C levels, a lot of them say, of course we're compliant. We know we've got teams of people or people that are knowing what they're doing. But actually, it's no good just asking someone, are you compliant? I think it was last month's session on the business processes. What really resonated with me was those processes and policies written once, read never. It's not just a tick box exercise. I've written some bits of paper and off we go. It's much more into that. It needs to be embedded in that whole part of your organization, looking at the people, the processes and the technology. So how do we know where we are? Well, the first thing to do, you've got to ask the right sorts of questions to the right different types of people, whether that's through workshops, interviews, understand what people's current practices are. Don't take, one person's word for it. Get them to demonstrate, are they compliant, and show you. From that point, you can then identify where we are. Where are we on our baseline? And then from there, once you know where you are, you can start to identify where you want to go. And that's really important. You have a plan, that long-term vision, that purpose, why. Once you've got that, you can then start building your action plan. And it's really important, as I said earlier, this is not just a simple project. These action plans, this is a lifestyle. You have to embed it in. And I think it was a couple of days ago at the weekend, somebody posted up on Twitter, it's about security. How do I know when I'm done? And somebody had actually posted that on Twitter. How do I know when I'm done with security? It's the same with compliance. You're never going to be done. There's always ways of improving. So it always needs to be reassessed. So let's have a look at kind of the maturity model. So we've got sort of some boxes here, and for some reason I'm not quite sure why it's gone grey at the top. So we've got this maturity model here. It's in 5 levels. So we're going from kind of initial, level 100, to manage, through to defined, to predictable, and to optimizing. And what isn't showing here is it should have some boxes that say people, processes, and technologies, but maybe that's on the next one. But really what we need to look at as part of this maturity model is only when you get up to level 300 that you're going to be compliant. So we had some discussions about this before Christmas, saying, well, shouldn't level 100 be the baseline for compliance, and then it's kind of compliance plus plus plus? But actually there are so many organisations that are not at that defined level. There are organisations that are doing very little. You know, compliance is not understood. Oh, I'm too busy, I've got to get on with my day job. Or they've got some kind of outline documentation, but they're not really demonstrating, they're not actioning that compliance. So when we look at the maturity model, it's really important that we need to try and get up to something like that level 300 as your kind of minimal viable product if you're working it in that agile world. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go through and start looking at each one of these in turn. So as with all of the maturity models, we've got 5 levels. So level 100, at this level, you know, this is where people say, you know, we can ignore governance, risk and compliance until there's an incident. And most people say, well, surely people don't do that. But unfortunately, there are people, you know, and organisations out there, but that is the situation. You know, it's not going to happen to me, sort of thing. Put the head in the sand, and then it only becomes, you know, reactionary. A lot of this can be, you know, around, oh, well, I don't have any personal data, so GDPR doesn't apply to me. But if you're sending, you know, emails, etc., and other information, you may be, you know, collecting personal data within even just email communication. So you have to assess where you are and put some sort of balance in place. Then we're on to level 200. So this is where, you know, we're starting to think about it's important and we should do something, but not necessarily how we're going to do it, you know, haven't necessarily demonstrated it. Then we go up to level 300, and this is where we really want to get people at level 300 level. So this is where you've started to define some processes, some policies and procedures. You've got that kind of the user and people processes in place, training in place to start bedding it in, getting people to understand. And you're actually doing some controls, you're doing monitoring to measure and make sure that you are saying what you say you're going to do. And then level 400 and level 500, as we go up there, we're really starting to say that governance, risk and compliance is critical. We need to make sure we're doing it right. You're starting to become much more proactive in what you're doing. And then level 500, it really is, it's embedded in, it's a strategic asset. Now, not everybody needs to get up to these top levels. No, but for some business sectors, it is important that they get there. So depending on the type of data you're managing, depends on where you really need to get to on this model. All comes back down to risk management. So that's why we've kind of put the risk into this. Not everything is applicable to everybody. So let's look at each one in detail. So level 100, maturity. An organisation does not believe that governance and compliance is important to its overall objectives. So the management doesn't consider in investing in it at all. It doesn't necessarily have any systems or processes in place for managing it. So it doesn't know what its risks are. It doesn't know the vulnerabilities. And so therefore, it doesn't know how much risk, what risk and fines and damage they could be exposed to. Therefore, they haven't assessed it. So people, or the people in the organisation, it's not part of their day-to-day roles. They don't think about it. They're just getting on doing what they normally do in their jobs. There are no processes or practices in place. Any action is going to be reactive. There's been a problem, quick, let's go do something. It's that sticky plaster type approach. Let's try and patch it up. And there's not really going to be any technology or processes in place. Data is going to be unmanaged, and it's going to be overexposed in ungoverned solutions. So let's have a look at a particular example that I've worked with. So it's a small manufacturer. It's about 300 people in a single location. They wanted to move to Microsoft 365 products. Go in, talk about all the governance and compliance. And it was a case of, we're only a small organisation. It doesn't really apply to us. We don't need to do all of this. It's all too complicated.
Nikki, what are KWs and FLWs?
Oh, sorry, knowledge workers and frontline workers.
Perfect.
Sorry. Yeah, so this was like a manufacturing. So they had people that were office based, but people are on the shop floors as well. Their approach was, we must be doing it right. We've never had a breach. And, I haven't got that time to put in that effort for compliance. It's getting in the way of the business. And the other thing that tends to happen here is, the managers know best. They know their data. They know what controls and processes they need to put in there. Other thing that I found here is we don't store sensitive data. Email is not personal identifiable data. GDPR has made it quite clear that actually if you're processing emails, an email address is classified as personal data. You need to manage it. It's not vast volumes. So when you risk assess it, it's relatively small, but it is still personal data. So you still have to comply. Other thing that I find also with small organisations, that they're not going to have a particularly mature IT team. So they have not got necessarily the technical or even the business skills to manage this. So at this level, what we need to do is get them to understand that risk. We need to find a champion in the organisation. They need to understand the risks of non-compliance. That, is it the case of if they don't comply, they're going to jail? Is it a case of they get such a big fine that they cannot continue running business? Or is it a case that, part of their organisation may not be able to work? So that's how we have to try and move them up to level 200. So now at level 200, what we tend to see is that governance and risk and compliance is understood, but it's not effectively being managed. It's not really that driver. Organisations know it's important, and it's somebody else's job that's going to do it. So we don't really have those formal roles. It's dependent on people in the organisation. So, for example, if it's finance data, you tend to have someone knowledgeable in finance say, I need to protect my finance data or my HR data, but there's nobody looking at it holistically across the organisation. And there's still really a low awareness within the organisation of, risk and compliance. What data is important? All data is equal at this point. So when it comes to things like technical controls, there might be some technical controls in place, but technical controls on their own are not going to do anything unless the people have been trained. And it's not just training. You've got to do the adoption. You've got to embed that change into the organisation to make sure you've got controls in place. You need to use them. If you don't use them, there's going to be consequences. So let's have a look at an example really of a level 200 organisation I was working with. This was a UK logistics company, 250 knowledge workers and just under 4,000 frontline workers. They're in multiple locations all around the UK. So it's quite a fragmented organisation to work with. So from the board level, they really understood where they needed to go. They'd put a lot of work on written policies, but they were difficult to enforce. And the reason it was difficult to enforce for this organisation, it was so fragmented. It's like those Chinese whispers and everything. How do we get that streamlined, structured message across to everyone to make sure everyone, adheres to the same set of rules? But what they didn't really know is where their sensitive data was. So they've got a set of rules, but what am I going to protect? How am I going to protect it? You know, you don't want to protect everything and lock everything down. So their starting place was, well, we don't really know where to start. We don't know where our sensitive data are. And then when we looked at the frontline workers, it was all a case of we use WhatsApp to communicate. Everyone's got a personal phone. It's easy. You know, we don't have multi-factor authentication or any of these other blockers. So in this organisation, there was really no rules on what data was stored where. And because they didn't know where their sensitive data was, it was really difficult to try and put those policies and procedures that they worked in into practice. So you've got to have some sort of rules to be able to enforce your policy. So what we needed to do here was really to make sure that C-suite understand that they're accountable and to really understand their data. That was the point. It was fragmented, it was disjointed. You can't govern what you don't know. So that was the first thing, is let's go away, assess that information, do that maturity assessment, and then help them build a roadmap so they can kind of target those low-hanging fruits, those quick wins, and target the sensitive data. So that's what we did. So we moved on now to a level 300. This is where I would expect all clients that I work with to get to as the minimum. So really, it's now essential to the business. You've got this top-down cultural approach. You've got standardized processes, and it's being baselined and it's being measured. People and staff are now being trained on a regular basis. So people understand their own individual accountabilities, and that's important with an organisation and managing your data. Everybody needs to be accountable. It's not somebody with a particular job role. Everybody has a duty to protect their organisational data. So you start seeing sort of roles in place. You start making sure that people are regularly informed, use cases, stories about compliance and the risk of not complying. I think that's really important. Get people to understand why they need to do what they need to do. So you've got processes and controls in place, and they are being measured, but maybe inconsistently. You know, it could be ad hoc. Often this is because roles are siloed, processes are siloed, so you haven't got that consistency to measure across. So when it comes to technology, we're starting to get controls in place, but you're still relying on the people applying the controls. So, you know, getting that kind of user adoption and training is really important, that people side of change, to make sure that if rules require a user to do something, they know what they need to do and why. And you may start seeing some areas of automation around some of the high risk areas, but they do tend to be more, say, like finance and HR, but often they're in their own line of business solutions. So let's have a kind of look at some examples now. So this was a global publisher. So it had 11,000 people in it, and they were across 20 or so countries. The big problem with this organisation is that it had sort of multiple different companies within it. So it wasn't kind of one board. There were, I think, 5 boards in the company. They all wanted to work completely separately from each other, but they were sharing the same Microsoft 365 tenant. So we needed to come up with some sort of consistency and standardization. So they were managing their governance, risk and compliance, but in 5 ways. So that was kind of one of the difficulties. So it was difficult for them to get consensus between the companies who was doing it right. And at that point, they were trying to put a standard set of controls across everything. Yet there were different parts of the businesses doing different things. They weren't thinking of tailoring. So they got that compliance being managed differently. They'd implemented a set of standardized technical controls in Microsoft 365. But again, they hadn't necessarily listened to the particular nuances of the different organizations. So they weren't necessarily the right controls, even though they had a set of controls. Well, what they were trying to do is they were trying to standardize things. They were using SharePoint as their intranet to try and pull in that standard, training. Here's our policies, that single place to go for all things compliance. But say across 5 companies, you ended up with kind of multiple overlapping policies. So their kind of controls were, we want to migrate everything into Microsoft 365 because once it's in Microsoft 365, we've only got one place to govern it. But what they didn't do is they didn't look at their data in their external data sources and actually go through and govern it and deduplicate it and kind of retain what you want and delete the rest. They just dumped everything in. So the result was they used up their SharePoint quota quite quickly from there. They also haven't put any controls or things, even things like governance on teams. So with 11,000 people, I had 25,000 teams, and we managed to get those down to 11,000 teams by putting some sort of governance processes in place there. So really what we'd put in place, we'd put in some standard retention policies, keep the data you need, delete what you don't, rather than just dump everything in and just keep it all there forever. We put in that teams and that sites governance as well, making sure that there's a process of, only keeping those teams for as long as you actually need to do it. If you need to retain data for a long time, then actually Microsoft 365 probably isn't the right place. You've got cheaper storage elsewhere if you just want that long-term retention to comply with kind of business policies, etc. We'd put some DLP controls in here as well to block external access to some content as well, because with like a lot of organizations, they opened up at Microsoft 365 for guest access for Teams, but hadn't necessarily put the controls in place. So it's really important to start, if you're high risk data, making sure it's not externally accessible. And we'd started to use some of the features in the compliance center. So using that, the compliance manager, that compliance score to really start pulling your plan together. So how would one try and get to the next level from here? So level 300 may be as far as you need to go, depending on, the risk needs. But if you need to go further, then it's a case for this organisation that wanted to get to level 400. It was starting to put tailoring controls in place, risk-based controls in place, look at some of those adaptive scopes, etc. So it's not one size fits all. It's making it more appropriate, more tailored, and maximising really the tools that they'd got within Microsoft 365. So when we move up to level 400, what we're really looking now is it's critical. It's critical to the organisation. Organisations need to make sure that they're doing it right everywhere, every time. So this is more likely to be organisations that have got higher levels of governance needs. So we're talking about the banking industries, the healthcare industries, the defence industries, where there are much bigger risks if they lose their data. So if it's just, a small amount of data you're dealing with that's kind of some GDPR, I would say more basic data, you may not need to get up here, but some organisations need to get this level. At this point, you've got dedicated roles within the organisation. It's much more defined and for the foundation of the activity. And it's really empowering people now. So everybody knows that it's a shared accountability across the organisation. It's not somebody else's job to look after our data. It's everybody's job to make those informed decisions. So with the processes, they become more streamlined, and we try and simplify them with metrics and reporting, so they can be constantly tailored and refined as we go through. We need to make sure that technology is more targeted, it's more comprehensively used. So again, it's making sure we understand what data is stored where and why, and how we're going to protect it, and put appropriate controls in place. So an example of a level 400 company is an organisation was an international law firm. So again, law companies, it's not their data they're dealing with, it's their clients' data. So they have to be really risk adverse. So they need to put the appropriate levels of control. So with this organisation, there was about 4,000 people in 10 countries. I worked with them to upgrade their licenses to the full E5 suite. And also we needed to implement multi-geo in here. So this was an organisation where they had specific country-based requirements. So, for example, in Australia, the data about people in Australia had to reside within Australia. So there was particular rules around that. So we've identified actually there's going to be different rules in different countries. How can we do this where we have one Microsoft 365 tenant? So that was one thing, is let's now look at the different rules for the different organisations or parts of the organisation and not keep it the same. They had a dedicated compliance board here. So this wasn't just looking at the data, it was looking at all of those, governance, risk and compliance aspects across the whole organisation. The downside with something like this is change is much slower in an organisation like this. It has to be, they are risk adverse. They need to make sure that anything that's implemented, it has been thoroughly assessed and does what it says on the tin. So really the need here is to drive that productivity, but to balance those compliance risks as well. So an example here is I'm working with them and about accessing Microsoft 365 from mobile phones. It's a case of, we need to lock it all down. And having a look at their tenant, over 1,000 people are regularly accessing the tenant with their, mobile phones. Well, if you suddenly just kind of lock it all down, you might become more compliant, but actually people are going to find another way of accessing their data when they need to. So an example of that, is a lawyer needs to go to court and they need to access some important information. They need to get access at that particular point of time. We need to make it easy for people to get access to that. So what can we do to protect that? There was also the need to put in particular data loss prevention tools here, both for the download of data, but also the upload of data. They have a whole load of clients that are called cloud adverse clients. They've told the legal company their data must not be held in the cloud. So we needed to make sure that we were controlling what was going into Microsoft 365 as well as what was coming out as well. So putting that whole protection around that. So they have a roadmap to sort of really help maximize that technology. So things that they were looking at was, the advanced audit capabilities, making sure that they were put stored and protected and have controls on them to make sure that people are not exposing the organization. It's the same for things like the insider risk and the communication compliance as well, making sure that we're now looking at that internal risk rather than protecting the data from being overexposed. It's starting to look at the organisation internally and making sure that there isn't those insider risk elements of that. So this is where kind of we are at the moment with this organisation, and they really want to kind of maximise the use of the E5 licenses. So we're working with them to look at things like, custom sensitivity types, because there's no easy way. It's not like, we've got bank account details in there or credit card numbers in there to be able to classify content. So it's looking at how can we build some sort of custom sensitivity types where we can establish data that needs to be protected or controlled more. We're going to start looking at things like the adaptive scopes as well to be able to target and control data even more, because there are a lot of, say, country-specific things. So rather than having a policy that says keep data for a particular length of time, there's different rules in different countries. Now with these adaptive scopes, which is a brilliant step change for the policies, we can now group people out and say, well, everybody in Australia, you're going to have this set of rules. Everyone in America, you've got a different set of rules. So we can build that necessary steps and granularization in. And then lastly, really, we're now moving on to level 500. So a very, very small subset of people would get here. So with that last organisation, I'd worked on the level 400, getting into the E5 suite. So it was the compliance and the security that they decided to go for. They said both was important. But I think something like only 8% of the Microsoft licensing is in that E5 suite. So, you know, a lot of organisations can't invest or can't afford the money to invest in that E5. So it's not all about that technology. It's about how you can manage with the licensing that you've got. So when we get to kind of level 500, and this will be a really small set of organisations that need to get there, it's all about that strategic advantage. So when you're in that really busy competitive market, everybody is looking for that strategic advantage. So it's really embedded into that strategic planning with continuous assessment. You know, compliance and also security is built in by design. So people think about that not as an afterthought. It's right there at the beginning before any steps are put in place. Risk is now seen much more as enterprise-wide. So earlier on in the process, it might be down to somebody in IT to manage it. Now, you know, risk is seen holistically across the organisation, whether it's the compliance, security, or whether it's other kind of business risks in the organisation. So you've got that persuasive compliance culture. And as I say, you're secure and compliant by design. You know, companies want to make sure they are the very best and stay at the very best, you know, be at that pinnacle. So here we're looking at that continuous improvement. So you need to be having those proactive reviews, making sure things are controlled and are measured, and looking for the exceptions. So here we're looking at for those automation controls. You can't have somebody, you know, looking through piles of paper or reports or analytics. Information needs to be pushed to people when compliance, you know, I suppose compliance is not what it should be. So once you kind of breach your service level agreements for your compliance, things happen. Now, also here at the kind of level 500, often organisations are externally benchmarking. So this is where you tend to see things like ISO 27001 coming in for the, you know, that external benchmarking and governance. So you're starting to look at your supply chain now, making sure that anything that has your data on it, you know, whether it's your suppliers, your partners, etc., making sure they treat the data in the same way as you're doing, putting much more controls and assessments on them, looking at all of those processes and how you can manage that. So we've really got to make sure from a technology viewpoint, you're looking at, you know, automated risk-based and tailored integration. So it's looking at some of the, you know, the tool set, say you've got within in Microsoft 365, how can we automate it? How can we send alerts and notifications? How can we dig into this wealth of information we've got to actually say what's compliant, what could be out of compliance? So things like Power BI to delve in and report and to visualize where you are really. And what you're doing here is you're kind of managing your data now intelligently. So that's kind of the end of my walkthrough of kind of going through. I personally haven't worked with an organisation of being level 500. As I say, I think there's very few out there that can afford to invest in that. So, you know, that's why we're saying we want to work with organisations to get them to level 3 as a minimum. Say some more 400, you may get some that really start investing in that level 500, but they are going to be, I would say, the larger organisations dealing with particular sets of highly sensitive data. So just a few resources here that to look at. So because this is these links should be clickable because we're using PowerPoint Live. The top one will take us off to the maturity model on Microsoft Docs. The second one is the one-stop shop for the Microsoft 365 information, and that's really good. That's got all the information you want to have compliance. And the other thing is there's a new book here on Microsoft 365 Compliance, A Practical Guide to Managing Risks by Erica, and I think Erica is on the call today as well. Must say it's a really, really useful read and makes it much more practical and pragmatic. But, you know, to really round this up, you know, we started off, it was going to be governance, but actually when you kind of boil down to it, you have to look at governance, risk and compliance together. It's all about managing the risk and what is appropriate, what is that, your risk appetite, and to bed it in. It's got to be part of the culture. So for me, you know, governance, risk and compliance is not a project, it's a lifestyle. So thank you very much. I saw there was thousands of questions seem to be popping up. So I don't know whether we want to kind of go through some of the questions or whether you want to put your hand up and ask.
I think we've been handling quite a lot of the questions as far as we could in the background, Nikki, but absolutely, if anybody has any questions, please stick your hand up and ask Nikki direct. Or just shout out.
Nikki, can I have your autograph?
Of course you can.
Thank you. You're a star.
I mean, it'd be really good to get some feedback, because I say we've only just launched it, and a lot of this is based on the, you know, the work that I do as working in, I suppose, with Microsoft environment for about the past 5 years, looking at that governance, risk and compliance. But across my whole history of kind of in organisations, looking at kind of business transformation as well, it's looking at how we do the right thing. And there's, for me, so much of it is about, you know, the people and the processes, and it's not all about IT and the technology.
And just to tell people, Nikki and I are working on the companion document to this, which is the How to Elevate document, which will give a lot more practical advice of, you want to go from level 200 to 300, here are some meaningful steps you can take, as opposed to it being the, you know, the benchmarking kind of tool that the competency provides.